thank you for coming, and I hope it's not too hot here in London, though it's hotter than it sometimes is. But huge thanks to all of you for all the work you've done in preparation for the conference as participants in it, and again to the staff of the RAI and all the volunteers and everybody involved. It's a complex operation, and as David said, it runs through a full 4-year cycle, but of course then there's a second cycle running simultaneously, a massive amount of work. I'm sure we'll thank everybody again at the end for a successful conference, but just it looks wonderful as we start. The reasons in the aftermath, the reasons to hold a conference on anthropology and education at this juncture are many. At the RAI, we are utterly convinced of the profound contribution that anthropology can make to teaching and learning at all levels. Yet many challenges remain, whether we consider anthropology at the level of the university or in schools, or indeed in terms of the way that we explain our work to the interested public. The rich array of panels that are proposed and will take place here help us to understand more precisely where those challenges lie and the way that our colleagues are meeting them. I, for one, will learn a great deal from this event, as I'm sure all of us will. We in the global community of anthropologists are acutely aware of the way that education can play such multiple roles as a force for good. Yet at the same time, it can be weaponized in times of war and indeed in times of peace. As an instance of this, we have recently had to relearn the fact that the phenomenon of forced boarding schools for Indigenous peoples, even though we hoped that it was now firmly in the past, is far from being resolved and remains active in different parts of the world. We are therefore delighted that Professor Lorna Williams, Líl'watul from the First Nation, has so kindly agreed to be our keynote speaker tonight and explain the way that she, through a lifetime of commitment, has succeeded in increasing awareness in Canada and internationally of the profound harm to which such schools can give rise, not just to the community from which pupils may be taken, but also to their emotional and physical well-being. Professor Williams herself attended one such school, an experience that set her firmly on her life's work as an educator. During the course of her distinguished career, she has been Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Knowledge and Learning and is Associate Professor Emerita in the Faculty of Education and Department of Linguistics at the University of Victoria. She's been Director of Aboriginal Education at the University of Victoria and the Director of the Aboriginal Enhancements Branch in the British Columbia Ministry of Education. She received the Order of Canada in December 2020, well deserved. We can see just one of the many ways that her work has been put into good effect through her film, The Mind of a Child, which forms part of a program of this conference, which David has just referenced. So do see the program, and I do hope you can see that film. Yet, despite her early experiences, which led to the loss of her native language, and which she had subsequently to relearn, Lorna's aim throughout her work has not simply been to criticize and reflect on what has gone wrong, but to encourage with all the power at her command those in power to put it right. She herself has shown profound leadership in trying to construct something that is viable and original out of the wrong that was done to her and others. Throughout her life, she's developed curricula in Indigenous languages, seeking to utilize traditional teaching and learning practices. Her courses were also innovative for their use of Indigenous pedagogy. And above all, she has encouraged the revitalization of Indigenous languages, not only in the classroom, but more widely. Vital in itself, Professor Williams' work has an even wider application. Anthropological research today, it needs hardly saying in this community, is profoundly transnational, frequently examining the links between cultures and the way that they are reformulating in the complex, interconnected setting that all societies now are experiencing. How, though, is this variety to be reflected in our own educational systems here and abroad? How can we encourage the writing of curricula that ensure that the lives of our schools are enriched by this variety? In short, how can the richness of Indigenous cultures be reflected in the classroom in new settings? There are no easy answers to these questions, but in trying to find them, we will surely need anthropologists and the work they're doing. And Lorna Williams' own example over a lifetime will be inspirational to us all. So it is with very great pleasure that we now invite Professor Williams to deliver her keynote address, Rebuilding in the Aftermath of Residential Schools in Canada, 1831 to 1996. Lorna.
Kukstum kaukika, kukstum kaukapa, kukstumulkalap, tlekalap الجاونة, كان مخمن توالى الجاونة تتميخشا إلن نالكاسة. Wánosts'a nxkuachicha, tlilk'u Líl'watul xwa'ax nxnuk'nuk'a, tlaku xtleqan. Greetings to you all, and thank you to those who opened this conference and who organized it. It's really quite an amazing gathering. As I look at the speakers, at the people who are going to be sharing their stories, I say hello and I say thanks to the ancestors who are part of this land and who guide us, who encourage us. I want to say to them, I come with a good mind and a good heart, and to be on these lands with you. I greeted the ancestors of these lands by telling them that my people are Líl'watul in the Xtlatlim, and that my ancestors are here with me. And we're very happy to be here. Tonight, I'm going to be speaking about a very challenging and difficult topic. It's been challenging for us who've experienced residential schools in Canada. And these residential schools continue in parts of the world, around the world. And I know that the boarding homeschool programs here have been part of this, the people here. And I think that there have been many, and many different kinds. I think there were some that were very similar to the ones that we experienced in Canada. I just want to begin just by reminding us about those, why they were constructed. Residential schools were talked about for quite a long time before they came into being in Canada. And at the basis of them was to change us. My parents attended residential school. That's where they met. And it's only recently that I learned that my father's mother, whose name I hold, Wánosts'a, was also in residential school. So I always thought I was a second generation. I was the third. And so it was a big part of our lives. And the purpose of the residential schools was to remove us from the teachings of our people, to remove us from our teachers, our mothers and fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, and especially in our Indigenous world, the main teachers in our communities for children were the aunts and uncles. And so it was to remove us from them too. It was to remove us from the lands that nourished us, that we have a relationship, a deep relationship with, a caring relationship with. It was to break that relationship, to no longer be able to have a relationship with the land because Canada wanted that land for its resources and all that it holds. And so residential schools were only one form, though, a big one. There was only one part of the plan to eradicate Indigenous people. There was a long discussion that led up to a discussion in the joint session of Parliament in Canada. Those are rare joint sessions, but they held this one in 1947. And that was an important one for many reasons. One reason was it was the first time that a First Nations leader, his name was Andy Paul, was able to speak in that joint session of Parliament. That was rare, and it was a lot of courage and work on his behalf that he managed it. And finally, Indigenous people had a voice. So this, 1947, it took a long time, almost 100 years, for them to hear the voice of an Indigenous man on our behalf. But there was another voice at that meeting. He was an anthropologist. His name was Diamond Jeunesse. Hardly anybody knows of this. But Diamond Jeunesse provided a paper, and the name of the paper that he presented was called The Plan to Liquidate the Native People of Canada in 25 years. Can you say that? And think that there could be anything positive? Liquidating Canada's Native people in 25 years. So this is a paper he presented. The joint Parliament asked him to present it. And basically, the paper said that residential schools had been a failure. Why were they a failure? Because the Indigenous peoples of Canada continued to speak their languages, to tell their stories, and to have a relationship with the land. We had not become civilized. And so what he was proposing was, and he thought he was doing a good job, and what he was proposing was to close the residential schools and to move the First Nations children from First Nations communities to public schools. So up until then, Indigenous children could not attend a public school because public schools were provincial institutions. And so the federal government, who's responsible to the Indigenous people, and especially the First Nations, who are their wards, ran federal schools. And so the schools, the residential schools, were run by the federal government, who then made agreements with churches to operate the schools. So the residential schools were operated by the Roman Catholics, the Anglicans, what is now called the United East. I think they had a different name then. And in some parts, the Salvation Army. Because it was thought that for us to become civilized, we had to become Christianized. And that we were pagans and communicated with the devil. And so in order for us to be changed, then Christianity had to become part of our lives. And so, but public schools generally are seen to be not part of churches. Churches can run schools, but they're independent schools usually. And so what the federal government then had to do was to begin to close the residential schools down. And they began to do this. And so it was mentioned that I had attended a residential school. I came home without spirit, without ability to communicate in my language or in English. But it was because I lived in the part of my village where I was surrounded by people most of them had never been to school. And many of them who did were there for a very short period of time. And so our language, and because we were in a remote part of the country in mountains, our language continued to be strong. Our ways continued to be strong. And so I was able to relearn my language with the help of all these elders. I ended up in the hospital for 4 months. And so I learned English. And so I became bilingual. And the old people used to come and take me if they needed to if they needed to visit someplace where they needed English. And so I'd go to lawyers and doctors and the store and the Indian agent. And I was the interpreter. I didn't know then that's what I was doing, but I would just go between the two. And I think that really taught me a lot. It taught me so much about our people, about our ways, about what was happening to us. When I was about 11 years old, I noticed, this is shortly after I left residential school, I noticed that there was a change that occurred in my community. And many changes. I saw that there were children who were coming home and they had no family. People don't realize, people don't think about what it must have been like in a family, in a community, to have children disappear. Maybe there are places in the world where that's normal, but that wasn't normal in our world, where children were very, very important part of a family, very present. And so think about it. Think about your family, your children, your grandchildren, and all of a sudden, one day, they're no longer around. They're no longer in your life. And then all of a sudden, all these children come home. They're strangers. They no longer speak the same language. They distrust their parents, their aunts and uncles, and grandparents. And oftentimes, what I also saw was that parents also began to withhold. They withheld the language from their children, and they withheld passing on the knowledge of the people. Why? Because they thought that they were going to further harm their children. That because they loved their children, they wanted to protect them from themselves. Think about that. Think about that love that would move a parent to withhold knowledge and wisdom from their children. But that's what happened. And think about what would then occur in families, in family units, and in a community where a sense of community was powerful. I remember as a child attending our community gatherings. In the winter, the community gathered in groups and we shared stories, songs, the singing together, the drumming together. And it was these singing and drumming and using the flute to bring music, which is another language, to the community. And so we'd spend an entire evening listening to stories, dancing together, singing together, eating together. And this is how we learned our history. This is how we learned how to be with the world. This is how we learned how to be with the animals and with the rivers and the lakes. This is how we learned about distant ancestors. For example, there was a song and a dance that my mom and another woman in our community used to do. And everybody loved this. And if they didn't do this song and dance soon enough, everybody would start asking. And it was a long time before I realized what that song and dance were really about. And what that song and dance was about was the first Europeans that came into our valleys came on horses. And first, there was a song and a dance from a chief who had fallen asleep by a stream after hunting. And the stream told him and sang a song to him to tell him about these beings that were coming, that they didn't know whether they were human or what they were, because they had so much hair all over their bodies. And they were riding what looked like deer, but they didn't have horns. Not too long after that, a group of Spanish explorers came, visitors, into our valley, and they came on horses. They spent time in our villages, because at that time we didn't really stay in long-term villages. They were, usually very transient, because we lived all over the land. But they came and spent time with us, with our people, and then they left. And on their way out, somewhere along the way, and we don't really know what happened, but they all died except for one. And so he's the man. So they found him leading his horse. He was lost, and he lost his mind. But they brought him home and took care of him. And that's what this song and this dance were about. I share this with you because that is how we told our stories. Because our languages at this time were oral languages. They were not written. And so we had to find and have different ways of sharing that knowledge and to remember. And so this whole way of remembering had to be constructed in such a way that people knew who they were, and everybody had a responsibility to remember and to share. And so that was done in stories, in these songs, these dances, and in every way. So there were different systems of stories. Another set of stories, for example, it was called the Shkokol. And Shkokol means the stories that tell of the things that take place. And so this story that I just shared with you would have been a part of that. But also the Shkokol were also the stories that were told when people traveled and they came back, and they would tell the story. So when I go home, I would Shkokol to my family to tell them about my experience here. But it was also the stories that hunters told, or berry pickers, or plant pickers, or would talk about the land. And they would talk about their relationship with the animals that they were out to hunt. Because it was important that we, who are left behind, have that relationship. And so they would talk about, so we would have a relationship with the animals, but they also talked about the land. And so that people then would know what we needed to do to care for the land. So they would talk about the streams, the state of the streams, because sometimes there would be because of weather or things that happen, and there'll be lots of things, might fall into the stream. And so those streams are extremely important. And so if it sounded from the story like it needed to be cared for, then people would go and care for it. In the story, they would talk about the plants that they saw, and so that we would know. And humans are extremely, extremely hard on land, very hard on land. And so there would be times through these stories when people would know that that part of the land needed a rest from humans. And so humans would stay away. And just to let it breathe and rejuvenate itself. And that was really important. And so the stories then were extremely important. And so I left you in 1947 with a paper that said the residential schools were a failure because we were still connected to those stories. And so I also want you to know that schools from the beginning were the battleground for our hearts and minds. So as an institution, it was the tool that was used to deliberately erase our languages, our histories, our ways of life, our connections with our ancestors, our connections with our families, our connections with the land. So education for us was harsh. The residential school, they tried to remove us from our families so that they could replace and place a certain knowledge system in us. And so that's what those were for. And Diamond Jeunesse in his paper said that public schools, our attending schools with the other Canadians, would help us to know how to be civilized. And so the process began to place us into public schools and to close the residential schools. It took another, 50 years for that to happen. In 1967, and one of the other things that Diamond Jeunesse proposed was to dismantle Indian reserves. So they said that if we lived with everybody, then we'd learn how to live. And so up until then, we were segregated and confined to reserves. And so if we wanted to leave, we had to have special permission. And so he said, for our sake, those need to be dismantled. There were a number of other things in that paper that they were proposing. But in 1967, our current Prime Minister's father was Prime Minister, the first Trudeau. And Chrétien, who became Prime Minister later, was the head of the Indian Affairs Department. And so what they began to plan was a way to do away with Indian reserves. But there were Indigenous people who were very, very courageous and mindful that we had to be a part of this discussion. And so there were a number of things that happened that helped the government to see that just wiping away reserves was not what should happen. And so one of the things that took place, remember what I said about education being the battleground, being the tool. Well, there was a paper that was put forward in 1967, Indian control of Indian education. This is a powerful piece. So again, education was being used. And out of that, the decision was made to not do away with reserves yet. But it also led the way. It led the way to Indigenous people finally being able to run their own schools. So Blue Quills in Alberta was the first one in Canada. My community in Mount Currie in British Columbia was the second school. For 10 years, we were able to devise a schooling system that made sense to our people. One of the first tasks that we did was to do a survey, a household survey. And so I was sent to talk to every family in Mount Currie and to ask them, what would you like for your children to learn and experience in school? Now, this was a real shock because somebody else outside had always made that decision for us. So it was a difficult one for our people to try to answer. You know, sometimes people were very angry at me and slammed the door in my face. Others brought me in and made me a cup of tea, and we talked about education and learning. Out of that survey, there were 4 things that they wanted, that they said they wanted in a school. One, and the first one, was about our language, because they could see that there was a major, major language shift happening. It happens really suddenly in a community for a language shift to happen. And it was happening in our community. The language was no longer the main language in many families, and they could see that. And so they said, we have to work on our language. And our children have to learn our language. So language was one. The other was, they said, we want our children to know and to learn their history. And this was really important because in schools at that time, whatever was mentioned about Indigenous people was that we were leaving the earth, that we really didn't have any place on this earth, that we were not really a valuable group of people. We were survivors and a burden to society. And nothing from about us was in history. Like that man that made it into the joint houses of parliament. I mean, that's a huge thing. Yet in Canada, people don't know his name. And he did amazing work. He was never part of history of our lands. So our people said, we want our children to know their history, our history. They also said, we want our children to know what happened to us. And at that time, in the early 70s, we didn't really understand the word colonization, but we knew the idea. And the parents said, we want our children to understand what happened to us. And then they said, our children have to live in two worlds. They have to live in our world. They have to know that world. But they have to also live in the white world. And they have to know that world. And they have to be able to go back and forth without losing a sense of self. Now, these were huge ideas. And they were ideas that at that time, people weren't in the academic world really writing about these or talking about them. And we searched the world to try to understand what had happened to us. And that's why it's important. It's important for you in the field of anthropology, in the fields of education, to understand your disciplines, how they evolved, what they stand for. I have been very grateful to the work of someone who's sitting in this room today. His book, called Maps and Dreams, was the first time that I read a textbook that helped me to see that we could and we can write from two worlds. The understanding of something from two perspectives. The perspective of Indigenous people and the perspective of the Euro-Western world was powerful. It's important that we work together to be able to do this. Working at being able to keep the languages thriving and living throughout this planet is extremely important. We say that our languages are the voice of the land. We can see, for example, when the land changes, the language changes. It can be the same language, but the variant changes when the land changes. And so it's important for us to protect and to hear the voices of the land in order for us to be able to maintain and to have a relationship with the land that feeds us, that gives us water to drink, that gives us our houses to live in. That helps our mental health, our emotional health, our spiritual health. So that connection between our languages and the land is extremely, extremely important. And across Canada, it is something that we've been working on since the 70s. Our languages, I told you, are oral languages. Since the 70s, many of these languages have been developing a writing system, something that your language you've been doing for more than 500 years. We have had 50, well, a little bit more than 50. And it's been interesting. It's been interesting to work on a language, to shift it from an oral language to a written language, and to know and to be able to see and to feel the changes that occur in that language. And the way that people learn also shifts when they've been exposed to a writing system or when they've been only exposed to an oral way of learning. Something happens. And so these are what we've had to figure out. In Canada, we have not been able to register our names on birth certificates, on marriage certificates, on death certificates, on passports. We've all had to use an English or French name. We could not use our own. So I could not be registered as Wánosts'a. Why? Wánosts'a. Because of that last glottal stop. When I was writing, in my Dutch, had a Dutch student, linguist, PhD student from Leiden, who came to work with us. And we're the ones that developed the writing system. And so the glottal stop in the International Phonetics system is a half-developed question mark. And I just couldn't use that symbol in our writing system. And the other thing was we had to saw off the dot if we were going to use that on a typewriter, because that's what we were using at that time in the 70s. And so we decided that we would use the number 7 to signify the glottal stop at the end in my name, for example. Wánosts'a has a 7 at the end to denote the glottal stop. There are many sounds, many places in our language that use a glottal stop, and many languages, indigenous languages, use a glottal stop. And so we all thought just using the number 7 was the best way. Well, Canada said, we cannot register your names using that symbol because it's a number, and we don't allow numbers in our registration. And we also don't allow the other systems, writing systems that you use. And so many children have been born and have been given a name, an indigenous name, and they've passed away and they've never been registered. This is in a very generous, supposedly, country. Well, last year, 3 young women asked to meet with me over coffee So we arranged a coffee meeting. They were from the provincial government. And they were given the task to figure out how to register Indigenous people with their names. So this last year. So this is happening. This is quite a big move because of the way that Canada is constructed. It would mean that if BC does this, they're going to have to convince the other provinces and the federal government possibly to go along. But they're working on it. Sometimes when they call me, I think they're going to tell me that they're giving up. And I remember saying that to them once. And they said no. And they've been continuing. And so there are many ways that we're working on rebuilding. The other thing that's happened that I think has made a huge impact is that you've heard of the Royal Commission on Residential Schools and the long report that came out and the action plan that people are trying to put into place. This has been a challenge for Canadians in institutions, especially in schools. There's a fear that people have because they know they don't know. And so catching up, learning, and being able to hear, and this is a very important thing, to be able to have citizens hear Indigenous people, to hear our stories, to hear where we're coming from, and to work with us, not for us, not on our behalf, but with us. And that's a huge thing for people to learn. And just to give you an example, I shared this today with some people. In December, on December 19th of last year, a ceremony was held on the island of a language that that in the early 70s, I was told was extinct, that it was gone and it was no longer counted in the numbers of languages of Canada. Well, two people who remembered the language, hearing the language when they were children, came forward. They still remembered what they heard. They had leadership who were committed to bringing their language back. But the key was also the young people. There were young people who had taken it upon themselves to research, to study language and language revitalization. And they were determined to bring their language home. At the University of Victoria, when it became a university and a department of linguistics, the first linguist who became head of that department said that all the linguists had to work on an Indigenous language. They listened to him. Some of them didn't like it, but they listened to him. And lo and behold, one of them had collected data on this language. And they were in boxes. His research were in boxes. in the basement of the building. One of the current linguists found it and figured out how to use it and to share it with the people. And so the partnership then was led by the community, these young people with their leaders, with the people who remembered their language, the university, and an organization that I've been a part of. It's a very unique organization called First Peoples Cultural Council. Their task is to support Indigenous communities to work on their language, to revitalize their languages, to recover their languages, to reclaim their languages, and to maintain those languages. And they do many things for people of all ages, from babies to adults. And they do all kinds of things that the communities want to do to revitalize their language. And so it is a partnership then with the community, with this organization, and with linguists, those experts who know how to work with Indigenous people from the university. So we were able on December 19th to be able to shift that language from an extinct language to a living language. I tell you that story mostly, I mean, that's to be celebrated, especially in the decade of Indigenous languages around the world. This is a story that can be found in any place on this planet. There are so many Indigenous languages that need to be supported and counted and named. And so we were able to do that with this language. And it's because of the partnerships, the working together, the sharing, and the willingness, and to have the courage to move forward. There are many other things that have happened, with at the end, with ending residential schools. And one of the areas that really needs a lot of work is the way that higher education institutions are designed and constructed. It's in order for us to be able to do the work we need to rebuild, to build. For example, at the University of Victoria, I designed a course called Learning and Teaching in an Indigenous World. And one of the things we focused on in one of these courses was music. Because in the Indigenous world, singing and music can come from the spirit world. It comes from each person's spirit. They tell stories. And so it's very difficult to bring these songs and singing and music into a music education program that's quite focused on Euro-Western music. But this group decided to do this. there were 50 people in the class. There were Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people. Amongst the Indigenous people, there were many who were just finding their way back home. Because residential schools were one thing, but there were many areas where Canada dislocated Indigenous people, Indigenous families away from their homelands. And so there were many, so there right now, there are many, many, many thousands of people now trying to reconnect to their Indigenous world. So in this course, these courses, these people were finally finding a way to have even a little connection to their Indigenous world. And so there were many of those people. There were non-Indigenous people. There were music teachers in this class. There were Indigenous people who were very, very well established in their Indigenous music world. And I invited composers, people in their communities who had learned to compose. And so the task for this class was for the students to learn to make a drum, and then to learn to use a drum, and then to learn to create a song that they would gift to the music department. So it was learning. It's a process of learning how to do all these things that helps people to enter our world. And those are what we need to be able to do in institutions such as this, to work together, to have the courage to enter other worlds. And I can see in your program that you've thought of this, and that there are people here who are willing to share their stories, to share their knowledge. And I want to encourage you to learn from each other, to be open, and to know that there are other worlds that can help us in our own worlds. And that to learn other people's worlds does not mean giving up our own, but we can share, we can care, we can be generous, and we're all human. Kukshum kalap kika washapa tohto amash akalap iljauna kan muhmin twala kukshum kap. Thank you.